Okay, kita akan masuk topik iaitu scholasticism. Scholasticism ni, okay, it's a falsafah Christian. It's a Christian theology ataupun cara untuk membuat teologi secara akademik. So dia set up academic thesis. Thesis ni maksudnya bukan thesis yang kita tulis tu, maksudnya teori-teori akademik. And then dia gunakan falsafah untuk define ataupun ceritakan macam mana how it function, how to find God and what is God. Itu yang dia gunakan. So dia mencapai era kegemilangannya kurun ke-13. Sebab apa? Sebelum ni falsafah Greek dan Roman ni, Aristotle, Plato, semua yang kita bincangkan tadi tu telah diharamkan, okey, di Barat, kerana dia lebih pada isu apa kita panggil ni, isu dia kata benda-benda ni menyesatkan agama dalam agama Kristian. Tapi Islam telah ambil dan asimilasikan dia dalam teori Islam. So kurun ke-11 berlaku kita panggil perang salib. Jadi kebaikan perang salib ni adalah ilmu-ilmu ni telah dibawa masuk daripada dalam bahasa Arab ni, telah dibawa masuk ke Eropah. Dan filosofer di Eropah ni dia mula terdedah dengan idea Aristotle dan Plato, Socrates ni semua. Okay, ada the lion's share of this philosopher, kita kata Aquinas lah, Thomas Aquinas. Lion's share maksudnya kita selalu fokus pada dia. Okay, kita ada tapi sebenarnya untuk membicarakan Aquinas ni kita kena baca, kena faham John Duns Scotus. Okay, tapi kita mula dengan Aquinas dululah. So Aquinas ni dia Italian, dia berbangsa Itali. Dia nak cuba prove existence of God ataupun membuktikan kewujudan Tuhan dengan cara menggunakan cosmological argument. Okay, so dia nak dia ada motion, causation, contingency, degrees and teleological. Okay, so jadi bila kita sehargai satu je motion lah, dia are necessary, benda-benda perlu untuk universe ni atau dunia ni untuk berfungsi. Contohnya kita tengok sesuatu tu, contohnya sesuatu tu, bumi ni bergerak kan. Okay, bumi ni sentiasa bergerak, dia sentiasa berputar pada paksi dia kan. So dia akan tanya, kalau there is a move, there must be a mover. So who is this mover? This mover is God. Sebab tak mungkinlah dunia ni bergerak sendiri tanpa ada seorang yang bumi bergerak sendiri tanpa ada orang yang menggerakkan dia. Okay, jadi first move tu dibuat oleh Tuhan. So okay, jadi semua daripada semua lima ini je sebenarnya itu je nak cakap. The ultimate creator, the ultimate mover is God. Tapi dia menimbulkan satu masalah. Masalah dia ialah orang accuse Aquinas ni sebagai seorang yang kita kata terlampau rational, overly rational, terlampau rely on Aristotle punya idea. So dia tak, maksudnya rely banyak kepada the testament, pada Bible ataupun kepada ajaran church. Intelek dia terlampau independent. So dia create satu sistem ni and dia make God subject to the system. Padahal God ni sifat dia omnipotent. Omnipotent ni maksudnya dia paling tinggi, above everything. Okay, kalau ada sistem pun because he created the system, not because he is part of the system. And then there is something higher yang govern sistem tu, dan God pun masuk dalam sistem tu. Tak. Ini adalah criticism kepada idea Aquinas ni lah. Tapi John Duns Scotus ni, nama dia sebenarnya John Duns je, bukan Scotus. Scotus tu is Latin from Scotland. So dia orang Scotland lah. So apa yang dia kata, dia tak lawan Aquinas pun, dia cuma tweak, dia macam adjust sikit lah teori Aquinas ni. So dia kata teori dia, dia macam letak brake pad lah. Teori Aquinas ni macam laju sangat kan, orang tak faham. So macam slow down, tekan sikit brake. Okay, apa dia kata, will is superior to intellect. Otak ni, akal ni lebih superior, will ni adalah kehendak. Kehendak ni lebih superior daripada intelek. Contohnya kita macam okay, bila New Year ataupun PKP ni kita berniat untuk menguruskan badan. Okay, kita baca, kita ni, kita tu. Tapi kita tak buat sebab kita tak ada willpower. Walaupun kita ada knowledge macam mana nak lose weight kan, tapi kita tak buat. Jadi will ni akan govern, will ni atau willpower ni akan jadi driver kepada kita punya matlamat. So God ni punya will ni superior. Dia ada, maksudnya dia tak bound to creation dia. Dia tak perlu createkan sesuatu tu sebab sesuatu tu dia tak perlu cipta sesuatu tu sebab sesuatu tu menyumbang sesuatu pada dia. Sebab dia Tuhan, dia tak perlukan apa-apa. Dia superior, omnipotent kan. Jadi so dia nak create tu sebab will dia, sebab dia rasa dia nak create. This is dia punya will, God punya will, sebab dia superior. So dia cakap jadilah. Macam tu. Okay, yang ketiga, dia kata teologi, orang ketiga ialah
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
Nothing gets people talking like proving the existence of God. Just look at the comments on our last video. And that is what Anselm of Canterbury did. He claimed in the 11th century to have come up with a deductive proof of God's existence through what we now know as the ontological argument. And if there was such a thing as a social network of medieval Christian philosophers back then, it was positively abuzz with the news for a long time. Because almost 200 years later, Italian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas encountered Anselm's argument. But, like many others, he just didn't buy it. Aquinas did believe in God. It was just that, as a philosopher, he felt that it was important to have evidence for your beliefs. He knew that if he was going to dismiss Anselm's argument, he'd need to come up with something better. So he set out to construct 5 arguments that would prove God's existence once and for all. Yeah, 5. Apparently he was concerned that one wasn't gonna do it, so he figured that out of 5, one was bound to stick. His first 4 arguments are known together as the cosmological arguments, as they seek to prove God's existence through what he argued were necessary facts about the universe. So in keeping with the method that we discussed in our very first episode, we're going to examine these first 4 arguments of Thomas Aquinas and really try to understand them. And then we'll consider their merits and their weaknesses. Maybe the most striking thing about the cosmological arguments of Aquinas, at least to modern eyes, is that some of them are firmly based in the natural world. Even though he lived in a pretty unscientific time, Aquinas argued for the existence of God through his understanding of science, and with the help of what he thought was physical evidence. For example, the first of his cosmological arguments is known as the argument from motion. In it, Aquinas observed that we currently live in a world in which things are moving, and he also observed that movement is caused by movers, things that cause motion. Aquinas was convinced that everything that's moving must have been set into motion by something else that was moving. By this logic, something must have started the motion in the first place. Otherwise, you'd be stuck in a philosophical quandary known as an infinite regress. You get an infinite regress when, in a chain of reasoning, the evidence for each point along the chain relies on the existence of something that came before it, which in turn relies on something even further back, and so on, with no starting point. Basically, Aquinas thought the very idea of infinite regress was absurd, logically impossible, because it implied that any given series of events began with nothing, or more accurately, never really began. Instead, it could have been going on forever. In the case of physical motion, Aquinas wanted to trace the cause of the movement he saw in the world all the way back to its beginning. And he figured there must have been a beginning. Otherwise, for him, it would be like watching these blocks fall and being told that nothing ever pushed over the first block. Instead, they had always been falling down forever, backward into eternity. There must have been a time when nothing was in motion, Aquinas thought, and there also must have been a static being that started the motion. And that being, according to Aquinas, is God, the unmoved mover. So, his argument from motion ran something like this. Objects are in motion. Everything in motion was put into motion by something else. There can't be an infinite regress of movers, so there must be a first mover, itself unmoved. And that is God. Now, the second cosmological argument of Aquinas was a lot like his first one. Here he proposed the argument from causation, and it too sets out to avoid the problem of an infinite regress. But instead of it explaining the motion of objects, it set out to explain causes and effects in general all over the universe. The argument went along these lines. Some things are caused. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else, since nothing causes itself. There can't be an infinite regress of causes, so there must have been a first causer, itself uncaused, and that is God. Just like with the argument for motion, the point here is pretty simple. Effects have causes. If you think about how you wound up watching this video, you can trace the line of causation back from moment to moment. If you think about it long enough, you can probably go pretty far back. But Aquinas said, again, it can't go back forever. There had to be a first thing that started off the chain of causes and effects, and that thing is God. Argument number 3 was the argument from contingency. And we should step back and get a little background for this one. In philosophy, we often distinguish between necessary beings and contingent beings. A contingent being is, simply put, any being that could have not existed. That includes you. Sure, you do exist, but you could not have. If you had never been born, the world would go on. And yes, things would be different. We've all seen It's a Wonderful Life, but the world would go on. Instead, your existence is merely contingent on the existence of other things. In your case, you only exist because a certain sperm met a certain egg and swapped some genetic information. You're basically a fluke. But what does that have to do with God? Well, again, Aquinas believed that there had to be something that prevented an infinite regress of contingency. That would mean that the contingency on which everything existed would just keep going back in time. And we can't have a world where everything is contingent, Aquinas said, because then, by definition, it all could easily have never existed. So he needed at least one necessary being. A being that has always existed, that always will exist, and that can't not exist in order to get everything going. And that necessary being is God. Aquinas spelled out the reasoning of his argument from contingency this way. There are contingent things. Contingent things can cause other contingent things, but there can't only be contingent things, because that would mean that there's an infinite regress of contingency and a possibility that nothing might have existed. An infinite regress is impossible, so there must be at least one necessary thing, and that is God. Let that marinate in your brain for a minute while unpacking the next argument. This one is built on the idea that we simply need a measuring stick in order to understand the value of things. Good, bad, big, small, hot, cold, none of these concepts can exist in isolation. If you go out for a walk and you see an animal, it's like this big. That animal would be on the small side if it turned out to be a dog. But if it were a rat, that would be huge. How do we know? Because we gauge the size of things in terms of other things. The same idea applies to more abstract concepts, like your grades. How do we know that an A is good? Because it's at the top. We know that there are grades lower than an A, but nothing higher. And Aquinas thought that all our value concepts would just be floating randomly in space if there weren't some anchor, something that defined the value of everything else by being perfect. And that, again, is God. This is how Aquinas developed number 4, known as argument from degrees. Properties come in degrees. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect against which everything else is measured. God is the pinnacle of perfection. Okay, we've considered Aquinas' 4 cosmological arguments, but remember, that's only step 1. The next and equally important step in philosophy is critical evaluation. So what do we make of them? As philosophers, if you think an argument is flawed, it's your job to try and figure out why. And by and large, philosophers, theists and atheists alike, have been relatively unimpressed by these 4, having found many problems in them. For one thing, these arguments don't seem to establish the existence of any particular God. Even if the arguments are correct, it doesn't look like Aquinas gets us to the personal, loving God that many people pray to. Instead, we're left with unmoved movers and uncaused causers who seem to have little in common with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who feels emotions and cares about his creation and answers prayers. Basically, this objection says that Aquinas' God is so far removed from the God that theists actually believe in that it doesn't help anything. But maybe you're happy just believing someone's out there, that's fine. But then, how about multiple someones? Because guess what? Aquinas' arguments don't rule out polytheism. There's nothing in any of his arguments to prove that God isn't actually, like, a committee. Aquinas' cosmological arguments also don't prove the existence of a sentient God. So it might be an old guy with a beard, it might be 6 old guys with beards, but it also might be an egg, or a turtle, or just a big block of stone. These observations have made some philosophers uncomfortable with Aquinas' ultimate conclusion. But there are 2 objections that are thought by some to be real nails in its coffin. The first is simply that Aquinas was wrong in his insistence that there can't be an infinite regress of anything. Aquinas takes it as a given that there had to be a starting point for everything, whether it's the movement of objects, or causes and effects, or contingent beings being created. But it's unclear that this is true, or why it has to be true. If infinite regress can be possible, then Aquinas' first 2 arguments fall apart. But perhaps the most significant charge made against Aquinas' arguments is that they're self-defeating. That is, they actually prove themselves wrong. For example, if Aquinas is right that everything must have been put into motion by something else, and everything must have a cause other than itself, then it seems that God should be subject to those same stipulations. And if God is somehow exempt from those rules, then why couldn't other things be exempt from them too? If they can exist without God being responsible for them, then we don't need God to establish things in the first place. Alright, I feel like I've given you a lot to think about. So before we close, let's pause and remind ourselves about a couple of things. First, you can accept a conclusion but reject an argument. So you might agree with Aquinas that God exists, but think none of his arguments prove it. Second, if you disagree with an argument, you don't just get to say, yeah, you're wrong. You have to give a counter-argument. What did Aquinas get wrong, and how can you do better? Why are your reasons superior to his? Remember, philosophy is a dialectic. Yes, Aquinas has been dead for centuries, but he started a conversation, and you get to participate in that when you engage with his arguments and offer your own, either in an effort to help him out by fixing flaws in his arguments while preserving his conclusion, or by refuting his entire project. This is what it means to do philosophy, to engage with arguments about stuff that matters, and whether or not there's a God seems to matter quite a bit, particularly in the lives of theists. Today, we learned about cosmological arguments and considered 4 of them. Next time, we'll look at Aquinas' 5th argument, the teleological argument. This episode of Crash Course Philosophy is made possible by Squarespace. Squarespace is a way to create a website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas. Squarespace features a user-friendly interface, custom templates, and 24/7 customer support. Try Squarespace at squarespace.com/crashcourse for a special offer. Crash Course Philosophy is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. You can head over to their channel and check out some amazing shows like PBS Idea Channel, The Chatterbox, and PBS Spacetime. This episode of Crash Course Philosophy was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio with the help of all of these awesome people, and our equally fantastic graphics team is Thought Cafe.
In this lecture, we're looking at Duns Scotus and his reaction and his development of the scholastic movement after the time of Aquinas. And Scotus is one of these pivotal transitional figures in the high to latter Middle Ages. Scotus has not always been appreciated by those in the modern world. In fact, the honorific that's given him as one of the doctors of the church is that he is the subtle doctor. Now, when the Catholic Church names him as the subtle doctor, of course, they're not using it as a sort of backhanded compliment. But in the modern world, it is often taken as this. Scotus's name, in fact, teachers always like to point out, is where we get the name Duns. Whenever we use the word dunce, we always have in mind the poor child in the corner wearing the dunce cap, being punished for being so dense. And there is something of an analogy here to what the dunce word was in the Middle Ages. Dunce, in its historical meaning, actually refers not to Duns Scotus himself, but to those who followed him, the so-called Dunsmen. And what's meant by this is Duns Scotus himself was very subtle, hence the name, the subtle doctor. He had lots of different distinctions and lots of different categories that he applied to the scholastic method. Well, those that came after often got a little ham-handed in their use of the analogies or the subtle distinctions that Scotus had come up with. But historical jokes aside, jokes about Duns Scotus being a bit too obtuse and hard to understand, what we want to do in this lecture is talk about the ways that he is important, the ways that he shapes the late medieval world and ushers in some changes to the ways that we talk about scholastic theology. And we can begin by just looking at Scotus's life in general. Actually, compared to others in the Middle Ages, we know very little. We know that he was Scottish. In fact, the name Scotus just simply means the man from Scotland. It's not actually part of his original name. His name is actually John Duns. And the name Duns, too, follows a medieval pattern of naming a man according to where he comes from. John was born in the village of Duns, which is in Berwickshire, in the country of Scotland. He later becomes a member of the Friars Minor in Dumfries. He is thought to have studied at Oxford, though there is no evidence as to what college he was a part of or with whom he really studied. In terms of historical record, Scotus comes onto the scene for the first time in 1302, when he is suddenly lecturing at the University of Paris. And he is eventually kicked out of Paris as a result of the fight between Boniface VIII and Philip the Fair, or the King of France. Scotus, as a good Catholic, had sided with the Pope, and of course, if you're there in the heart of Paris and you're going against the king, you're not going to last very long, let's just put it that way. He is eventually restored, though, in 1304. He returns to Paris, though just a few years later, in 1307, he is sent to the University of Cologne in Germany. And it is shortly thereafter that he dies, and his tomb is there in the city of Cologne ever since. Now, there is one myth that's often associated with this. It is not the case, it is not true, that Scotus had lapsed into a coma and that he was actually buried alive. That's one of these urban legends that always arises around important figures, and this is simply not true. But as in keeping with the High Middle Ages, Scotus was a man of multiple countries. In fact, on his tomb to this day it says, quote, "Scotland brought me forth, England sustained me, France taught me, Cologne holds me." And it speaks to something of the cosmopolitan, multinational ways that these scholars would travel from country to country, and since their main language of engagement was Latin, they could do so without much trouble at all. Well, when we transition to Scotus's ideas, to his theology, we have to understand the context. Aquinas, of course, had the lion's share of the attention amongst all those who were scholastic ever since his life and his death. The writings of Aquinas are simply supreme in terms of understanding the sweep of medieval scholastic theology. Not everyone was happy, though, with the teachings of Aquinas. Aquinas seemed to dabble a bit too much in the rational method. He seemed to rely on Aristotle just a bit too much. And we've seen this back and forth. There is a trend towards rationalism and then a reaction back that usually comes with the expression of concern that theologians are relying too much on men like Aristotle and not enough on the scriptures or on the teachings of the church. And this is pretty much what happens here with Aquinas. Aquinas himself is not condemned. However, there are a number of condemnations that come about in the mid to late 1200s. One in particular, the condemnations of 1277 by the Bishop of Paris. And the condemnations of 1277 hold 219 theological and philosophical teachings that are considered to be suspect. The condemnations overtly mention that, quote, "some scholars of arts are teaching certain things that are now believed to be problematic." And that line is one of the problems of the interpretation of this, because Aquinas was not a teacher of the arts per se, he was a theologian. He was in the higher categories. Still, though, it does seem to be the case that these condemnations in particular are meant to stop the application of those who are reading Aquinas from over-reliance on philosophical or extra-biblical categories. The 219 condemnations stress the importance of revealed doctrine in the scriptures as it is taught by the church, over against dialectical or rational theological method. And the central thrust of these condemnations is that there are those who are appealing to the independence of the intellect over against anything else. Again, in the dialectical method, there is a privileging of the intellect or of the logical systems that we can think through. And the allegation here is that those who rely too much on the dialectical or the rational method, Aquinas being one, and of course Abelard being a pretty extreme case of this, these men, it is alleged, go too far in the binding of God. They make God subject to the system rather than God as the creator of anything like logic or whatever it might be. And so one of the stresses that comes out of the area of Paris in particular, as a reaction to this method, is an appeal to the omnipotence of God. This idea that God is not subject to the system, that he is not subject to logical forces per se, but that he is omnipotent. He is above any of our rational concepts or our rational methods. And so again, without condemning Aquinas, without throwing him out and condemning his works in general or with any specificity, we see here in the late 1200s, which is right when Scotus is writing and working, a real concern for the ways of dialectical theology and for some of their excesses. And so it is in the context of this that Scotus steps onto the scene. And as we'll see, Scotus in particular is trying to find a way to both be positively associated with the theology of Aquinas. He's not a reactionary. He's not overthrowing Aquinas. Rather, you might say he is tweaking in an effort to perfect the general trajectory as to where Aquinas' thinking was taking us. He tries to put in some brake pedals that stop us from over-reliance on putting God within a box or putting him within a system that may very well be the product of our own categories. Still, though, as we'll see, Scotus actually still relies on many of the same categories or many of the same assumptions that Aquinas himself held. So the way to understand Scotus is you have to see that he is trying to stop some of the problems associated with too much reliance on logic and the intellect without simply overthrowing the system. So he's going to apply brake pedals in some areas, ways that he thinks will stop too many conclusions going down the wrong path. And on the other hand, he's going to add some things, add some discussions to the mix that he believes will open up some new vistas, some new horizons for scholastic thinking. And so when we begin to look at Scotus's ideas, the most important idea that he really is going to tout, again, as a brake pedal to the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, is that Scotus is going to stress that the will is superior to the intellect. Now, the reason he does this is relatively obvious, and he's not the only one to do it, by the way, in this day and age. But what he does is he's saying, essentially, that the intellect matters, that our rational thinking matters. However, the will, the volitional part of our identity, the thing that drives us, is superior in the sense that it can overrule our intellect. You see, with Aquinas, the belief was always there that if you just get the intellect right, if you develop the proper thinking in the proper categories, you can actually penetrate into the complexities of God. You can understand him in his essence. Not fully, by any means. Aquinas is not going to say that. But rather, Aquinas will say that you need to get the intellect shaped in the proper dialectical method. And he believed, flowing out of that the will always follow suit. Scotus comes onto the scene and very quickly he says, no, the will actually can override our intellect. He doesn't want our wills, in other words, to simply be passive instruments. He doesn't like the idea that our choices are based simply on logical thought patterns. Rather, there's something more fundamental that drives us. And of course, this is a view that is shared by just about everybody in the modern world. We always talk about somebody who wants to lose weight or quit smoking or stop bad habits as needing to get their will in shape, not as an idea of getting different facts. Doesn't matter how many diet books someone reads, how many quit smoking campaigns or pamphlets they read, or any of these other kinds of things. The modern person, of course, assumes that it's not a matter of getting new facts into the person's head that's going to change them, but rather it's a product of the will, how the will, the volitional side of us, can almost act impulsively to override what we know to be true. Well, a lot of the wellspring of this does come from Scotus here. Well, what's the implication of what he's saying? Well, in large part, what he's stressing here is not so much a relationship to us, though it obviously has implications for how we view the human soul, how we view the will. Rather, what he is playing here is a move that, again, separates God from the created order. We'll often refer to this in the modern world as the creator-creature distinction. That is to say, there is only one creator and everything else is created. Well, by stressing the will over the intellect, Scotus believes he has a method for describing how God created what exists, how he created the rational structures of the world, and how he came up with these things in a way that doesn't make him bound to them. You see, because if you say that logic, or the dialectical method, or the categories of creation, all these very interesting things, are simply the product of an intellectually conceived idea, well, what ends up happening is you believe that the system itself is almost a software or an operating system that God himself really needs to abide by. You get some of this actually in Aquinas' teachings on ethics, issues related to the moral law, or issues related to God's process of understanding the law in relationship to sin. Aquinas doesn't actually take us to this point, but what the implications are as to what he's saying is that it seems as if God is bound by the system of this world. Again, if you go to Aquinas' teachings on ethics, there is often the implication and occasionally a more expressed reality, a more expressed belief, that God must always do what is right and good. Well, again, the problem here is you have to be careful, because if you say that there is a standard that God must live up to, what Scotus is sensitive to and others are sensitive to is that you've essentially bound God to a system. There's some standard above him that he must abide by. Well, the way Scotus gets out of this problem is, again, he stresses the will of God. God's will is superior to the categories of thinking. He then transitions into a discussion about the power of God. And this is an important one because it's one that we still talk about to this very day. And the question is one of, is God bound by creation itself? When God creates things, is he more or less creating things that must exist by necessity? Or is he creating things by the sheer power of his will? And the question here is often described as the problem of the absolute will or the absolute power of God. And there's a very concrete way of thinking about this. When God decided that he was going to create the world, and he was going to make a moral law or a moral code in which, let's just say, murder and adultery are considered to be evil things. They are sins. Well, Scotus holds out the possibility that God could have created something entirely different. Before he actually created, he had absolute power, hence the word omnipotence. He is utterly free before he creates to create a system or a world that is entirely different from the one that you and I know. Creation, in other words, is essentially arbitrary. Not arbitrary in the sense that it's chaotic, but arbitrary in the sense that God was not bound to create what he did create. Rather, it's an expression of what he wanted to create. God is absolutely free. Now, Scotus is not here trying to argue some type of relativism, as if there is a moral code that is different for each and every one of us. He affirms that once the world is created, this is the world that we know, and this is assumed. We have this world and the law of it, and the logic of it, and all these things, all the dialectical method that Aquinas loved. Scotus is going to affirm all of those things. He's going to want to continue them in the sense that Aquinas wanted them to continue. However, for Scotus, again, he applies a brake pedal. He says, don't think that you have some grand blueprint by which both God and creation both have to live up to. Your dialectical method is important, but God is not bound by it, beyond the fact that he chose this world to be the way it is, and therefore it is simply by the will of God. Notice again Scotus's, you might say, salvage or recovery efforts here to make sure that the teachings of Aquinas and others on dialectical method have a brake pedal, they have a stopgap, but that they can continue within the limits that he places on them. And there are others as well. Scotus very famously attempts to reassert a more positive or a more optimistic description of who God is. In this sense, you might say, to keep the analogy going, that Scotus is applying more of a gas pedal to the Thomistic system. Thomas, as we mentioned, had a great deal to say about the slipperiness of words, how we have to be careful that our words are not simply assumed to always be connecting to God in the most direct sense. Aquinas expressed a number of concerns about how we always equate our language with the existence of God, so that when we describe things as being good, well, how do we know that our concept of good is equivalent to who God is? Well, Scotus wants to actually make sure that we always have a positive whenever we're discussing God. Scotus in particular attacks something that is called the via negativa, or the negative way. And the via negativa is an idea or a tactic that was employed by Aquinas, in which he said that sometimes you come to the conclusion as to what God is, not by positive affirmation, but by whittling away the other options that don't fit. And again, this is called the via negativa. So to go back to the idea of God being good, well, the way that we understand who God is in his goodness is we say, well, is he good the way a slice of cake is good? Well, no, that's a goodness in relationship to taste. Well, is he good in relationship to my goodness or to the goodness of creation itself? Well, no, because there's sin, there's limitations, there's finiteness, all these kinds of things. And so what you do in the via negativa is you work through all the things that are not implied by a certain word or a certain description of God. and then eventually come down to a more precise conclusion as to what you mean. Well, Scotus has a great response to this. He says, quote, "Negation is not the object of our love." But that's a very perceptive point. Describing God as good and then simply getting at the definition of goodness through a negative limitation as to what he is not when we say that he's good doesn't actually give us a great deal of, here's that word again, volitional, willful love directed towards God. It rather makes the goodness of God something of a mental gymnastic game. Now, that's not the intention of Aquinas, but what Scotus is highlighting here is that there has to be some positive connection of our words to who God is in order for him to be the object of our love. And the word that Scotus uses here is a new one. He refers to something called the univocity of being. Now, this always creates a bit of a head scratcher for students. What in the world is the univocity of being? Well, again, let's go to this problem of our words and how we describe God. The problem in the Middle Ages prior to Scotus was that they really only had two categories for how our words work. Either our words are equivocal or they're unequivocal. So in the case of a word being equivocal, it means that whenever we say that God is good, we're saying that there is an equivalence between his goodness and the word that I'm using to describe him. At times, though, on the other side, we're using analogies to describe God, words that are not equivocal. So if I say that God is a rock, that he is my rock and my redeemer, of course, the implication here is not that he is some type of stone, that he's made of a granite or something like this. That's unequivocal language. The problem with both sides, though, is neither fully connects what we're describing God as being to who God is in and of himself. And Scotus stresses this. On both sides of these equations, whether you're using an analogy or whether you're using equivocal language, both have implied this idea that our words don't quite sync up perfectly with who God is. Even the word equivocal, it means that God is on one side and our meaning of what goodness is on this side, and there's no ultimate fundamental connection between the two. Scotus, of course, is going to feel that this is very much alarming. It's going to feel as if our language does not fully describe who God is, and if we love him, if we desire him, if he is the object of our love, then having that separation is a problem. Well, in the gap here, Scotus asserts a new idea, the idea of the univocity of being. The idea here is that though God is the creator, though he is far away and he is not to be bound by our system, still though, the very creation of things, like us in his image and like the creation itself, means that there is a connection. I'm actually inclined to say there's almost a DNA association between what we're saying, what we know, what we experience, and who God is in and of himself. Now, it's refracted through all types of things in creation. It's never as perfect as it's going to be when we're describing God. But the answer that Scotus gives here, when he's referring to the univocity of being, is he wants to say that when we're describing things, when we're experiencing things, when we use the word goodness, that there is a univocal connection. They are the same thing. One is the goodness that the creatures know, and one is the goodness of God, which is, of course, perfect and eternal. But they're not simply two things far apart, and our language is simply trying to jump the gap to describe who God is. Rather, Scotus argues, because we are the creatures, because we are created by him, the very nature of the creation itself, the very things that we know and experience, have some univocal connection to God. There is an equal sign between our concept of goodness and the ultimate goodness in God himself. And Scotus drives this point home, mostly again out of the concern that the over-reliance on logic and the over-reliance on this description of the problem of language was leading us down the wrong path. And so with Scotus, what we see is a couple of new ventures that, as they lead into the latter Middle Ages, begin to bring about a number of changes in how the church approaches the problem of theology. Scotus attempts at his very best to put brake pedals and, as I said, put gas pedals on different sides of the scholastic method. On the one hand, he wants to separate God and make sure that we do not believe that God is bound to the system. However, on the other hand, he doesn't want God to be far off, locked up in heaven, and that all we're doing is trying to describe God with our fumbling words. Rather, instead, he is omnipotent, he is the creator, he's not bound by our system. But nevertheless, because the system is a product of his will and he created it, because of that, our language can truly describe who God is.
Hello, selamat petang. So, hari ni kita akan belajar mengenai pengenalan kepada falsafah. Kita terpaksa mula balik daripada kita punya lesson 1 sebab kita dah tinggal lama, cuti yang lama kan. So, kita akan mula sekarang. Apa kita akan mulakan sekarang ni adalah apa yang dimaksudkan dengan falsafah. Okey, falsafah ni ataupun filosofi dalam bahasa Inggerisnya, philo datang daripada perkataan cinta dan sophia datang daripada perkataan hikmah, cinta hikmah ataupun love of knowledge, ataupun kita boleh simplifikan as academic study of anything. Okey, apa saja yang mengenai falsafah tu, apa saja knowledge boleh dikatakan ini adalah initial definition dia lah daripada segi etimologi. Okey. Tapi ada dua jenis falsafah. Okey. Yang pertama theoretical, yang kedua practical. So kita akan pergi pada theoretical. Theoretical ni yang pertama theoretical ni adalah satu kajian sejarah yang diasaskan oleh Aristotle dalam buku ni Metafizik yang mula-mula menengah-nengahkan kaedah theoretical ni. Tapi actually by default all philosophy are theoretical. Sebenarnya daripada default ni macam semua cabang filosofi adalah sebenarnya adalah apa kita panggil theoretical. Okey, so tapi sebenarnya maksud falsafah theoretical ni adalah kajian spekulatif, speculative study untuk menyaring teori ataupun dalam bahasa mudahnya adalah teori. Ini datang daripada perkataan Greek yang bermaksud to observe, untuk observation, untuk dilihat. Observation ni boleh berkaitan dengan vision lah, sama ada mental ataupun sensory. Yang boleh sensory tu maksudnya kita boleh rasa, boleh tengok, boleh ni, ataupun mental kita boleh fikirkan. Okey, practical maksud asas kajian falsafah untuk adalah kajian falsafah untuk pemikiran praktikal. Dia adalah juga teori. Sebab tu cakap tadi all philosophy are by default teori. Tapi dia lebih menekankan doing, practical things, benda kita lakukan, execution. Contohnya nilai, sikap, norma ataupun etika. So ni adalah dari segi practicality. Teori pada practical tu adalah di bawah falsafah practical. So kita akan pergi seterusnya kepada cabang-cabang falsafah. Dari bawah praktikal dan teoretikal ni ada beberapa cabang falsafah seperti metafizik. Metafizik adalah satu cabang yang memikirkan kewujudan sesuatu. Contohnya apa yang wujud, apakah sifat semula jadi benda tersebut, kenapa dia wujud, macam mana dia wujud. Dia lebih kepada tu. Kemudian kita ada epistemologi. Epistemologi adalah bidang falsafah yang memikirkan tentang ilmu pengetahuan. Macamnya soalan dia tu, apa tu pengetahuan? Adakah kita ada pengetahuan? Bagaimana kita tahu apa yang kita tahu? So benda-benda seperti itu. Okay. Bahagian seterusnya dari segi cabang ni, yang itu tadi kita sebut tu adalah teoretikal. Praktikal pula adalah etika. Contoh tentang dia telah memikirkan sesuatu tentang kemoralan. Contohnya dia persoalan dia, apa yang bermoral, apa yang tak bermoral. Okey. Jika ada apa yang membezakan moral dan tak moral tu, dan logik atau dalam falsafah penaklukan manusia. Maksudnya macam apa yang aku patut buat. Lepas tu kita ada estetika. Dia memikirkan tentang keindahan, estetik, cantik. Dia lebih kepada falsafah seni. Okay, so itu je. Kita akan masuk ke bab seterusnya.
This video quotes Plato, Aristotle, Jaspers, and Deleuze, but the ideas of many other philosophers are also present. When we consider philosophy and wonder about its nature, we will soon realize there is no official definition. Indeed, the question, "What is philosophy?" has many different answers, but none is considered to be the definitive one. In fact, to wonder about philosophy and to try to answer this very question is to philosophize. And this is a distinctive characteristic of philosophy as opposed to other subjects. For example, when we try to define physics, we don't necessarily operate as a physicist. In contrast, to consider the nature and origins of philosophy is itself philosophical work, and to understand that better it's worth examining its official beginnings. Etymologically, the word philosophy comes from Greek and roughly translates as love of wisdom. According to tradition, the word philosopher was first used by Pythagoras to contrast it with Sophos, the sage, the one who has knowledge. A philosopher, on the other hand, is one who wants knowledge, who seeks wisdom. Philosophy comes from this predisposition towards knowledge. It has often been pointed out that the way philosophy was born provides a model for answering this question. In fact, philosophy is more a how than a what. In its more genuine meaning, it refers to a way of doing, a predisposition, an attitude. The key is to see which elements form this attitude, such as Plato and Aristotle indicated that philosophy begins with astonishment, perplexity, or admiration towards what surrounds us. This feeling contains the awareness of one's own ignorance, and that's what drives us to seek knowledge. In what way? Precisely through questions. Philosophy is born from the question, from interrogation, and this is an interrogation of everything, an interrogation that genuinely intends to reach the foundations of everything. It is an absolute and radical questioning. For this to happen, we often need to cast out unacquired knowledge and submit it to critical examination. In fact, what we call Western philosophy is an examination, a constant discussion about some of the fundamental questions raised by the first Greek philosophers. Ancient Greeks started an itinerary of questions and answers. They began a dialogue that still stands. However, Western philosophy is a path in philosophy. Philosophy as such goes beyond the theories of the philosophical tradition. According to Jaspers, philosophy is the principle of concentration through which man becomes himself by partaking of reality. In this respect, philosophy is a basic dimension of humankind, and it is found everywhere, in dominant convictions, in proverbs, in myths, etc. Broadly speaking, these are the most important elements of philosophy. However, nowadays, this kind of answer is not considered enough, because the need to comprehend philosophy is linked to another question. What is philosophy for? This question usually refers to two aspects. The first and most common one relates to its utility in a very specific sense. What's philosophy for is equivalent to, what does philosophy give us? What kind of benefits does philosophy give us? This kind of question expects an answer like, philosophy is useful to repair shoes, to calm a headache, or to forecast the weather. In that sense, it's important to note that philosophy is basically useless, because it's not an instrument. It's even considered that it stops being philosophy the moment we try to instrumentalize it. But if we broaden the scope of the question and look for a more generic utility that does not focus on benefits, we will easily find practical uses for it. Philosophy can be useful for many things, and it's especially good at pointing out that this type of question is not neutral and hides prejudices. Which ones? For example, societies need to turn this type of utility into a supreme value. Or the idea that the market decides what is valuable or not, what is important or not. And it's precisely because of this that we can see the other meaning of the question. Because to ask what philosophy is for means to also ask about its importance. Why is philosophy important? Earlier we mentioned that philosophy is present everywhere, and that means that as much as we try to escape it, philosophy is unavoidable. In this sense, everybody philosophizes, because we have an attitude towards life and the reality that surrounds us. The key is to see if we are aware of it or not, if we have reached this attitude consciously and in an autonomous, reflective and critical manner, or if, on the contrary, we have accepted what has been given to us without questioning anything. Insofar as we value our humanity, philosophy is important because it is in our nature. But beyond that, a conscious and active philosophy is even more meaningful because it keeps us awake, it makes us aware of what we ignore, and invites us to think about our own beliefs. In short, it makes us think for ourselves. This can be hard work. Deleuze said that philosophy saddens us, because it makes us aware of the baseness of thought, of the shameful side of the world we live in. But at the same time, philosophy makes us free beings. And in this sense, philosophy is not only important, but necessary.
Let's unpack epistemology, ontology, and axiology. I would like to give this lesson a little warning. Please do not throw these words around at parties. There is no quicker way to kill the mood than to mention these three terms. Please only bring them up in class or around your academic friends. So first, let's do a little overview. These are the terms that describe the often unspoken assumptions about knowledge, people in society, and our values that rest beneath our favorite theories or favorite research. Each of them corresponds to a branch of philosophy, which can be very abstract, but let's not let that confuse us, because most people doing research don't spend vast amounts of time writing directly about epistemology, ontology, and axiology. The way it normally plays out is that researchers are just going about the research, and these areas or assumptions remain implied beneath the surface. The research will leave clues, and so if they're so assumed or beneath the surface, then why do we even talk about them? Well, understanding these three areas will help us gather a better appreciation and be able to compare and contrast different areas of research at a much more sophisticated level. So there is some payoff here. So let's start with epistemology. We'll go from general to specific. This is a branch of philosophy that studies knowledge or knowing. They ask questions like, how do we know what we claim to know? That's the classic epistemological question that you'll see in a lot of theory and research textbooks. A researcher might assume, for example, that knowledge is already out there just waiting to be discovered. And so it's our job as researchers to uncover this universal, unchanging, and absolute truth. In contrast, other researchers believe that people develop knowledge based upon how they perceive the world and through their experiences. That's how we create knowledge. Still further along this spectrum is the relativistic view that believes that knowledge is a social construction. In essence, whatever we treat as knowledge is knowledge. There is no universal or absolute truth. These are epistemological positions that are getting at this notion of knowledge. But like I said, most researchers don't spend many paragraphs in each given journal article spelling all of this out. They normally just get on with their work. But their research will leave clues. And I see that epistemology is most evident in the methods that they use to conduct their research. In other words, if they assume an objective reality, objective knowledge exists out there, then they will approach it that way. For instance, some organizational researchers do climate surveys. These are quantitative surveys driven by a statistical analysis. And the idea here is that if you ask the right questions, you'll get reliable and valid answers. And the results are meant to give you a snapshot of how things really are. In other words, there's an objective reality out there, and our survey is trying to show it. In contrast, there are other ways to get at knowledge, other beliefs about the best way to know something. For example, the ethnographic method believes that to really understand, to really know, you have to experience something for yourself. You can't study culture from the ethnographic standpoint, for example, from a distance. First-hand knowledge gained through experience is the best way to know. These are epistemological kinds of issues. Next, let's explore ontology. Again, we'll go from general to specific. This is the branch of philosophy that studies the nature of human beings. What is the nature of our existence as individuals in society, in the universe? Who are we? What are we here for? These are ontological questions. For example, do we make real free will choices? Do we make choices that influence the outcomes? Or are there forces that are determining our outcomes that are beyond our control? Another ontological question would be this: are we best understood as individuals, or is our nature best viewed as being part of a group, part of a social system? There's a movie called I, Robot, for example, an old movie with Will Smith. And in this story, there's a robot named Sonny, and he's very sophisticated, and he's trying to figure out why the guy who made him. What is his purpose? And that's an ontological question. There's a bit of dialogue where somebody asks him, Sonny, do you know why Dr. Lanning built you? And he answers, no, but I believe my father made me for a purpose. This is an ontological discussion. What is our nature? What are we here for? For me, the ontological assumptions beneath research and theory are pretty easy to spot. So for example, if they're studying individuals, like through personality tests or trying to figure out people's traits, then they likely are approaching us as individuals in society. If they are studying groups and relationships, then they are likely assuming that people are best understood in groups and relationships, like through the communication field or sociology. Another look at this is how we are situated in society in terms of the larger forces that we face. For example, does a theorist treat people as if they are at the mercy of a system that is out of their control, out of their hands? Or do they focus on the agency that people have to influence change? Depending upon their position, they are taking different ontological positions or assumptions about their research, and you can usually see that in the way they write it up. And third, let's talk about axiology. Again, we'll go from general to specific. This is a branch of philosophy that studies values. They ask questions about the values that guide our research to begin with. For example, what do we consider to be good or bad, right or wrong, beautiful or not? What do we value? Another axiological issue is what values might result from or be the outcome of our research. Axiology often asks questions about the extent to which our research can be totally neutral, or does our researcher opinion come into play and our personal values shape how we conduct and write up our research? Also, should our research be seeking merely to understand what we are studying, or should we be studying something with the goal of changing society for the better? That's an axiological question. And if we want to change society, what do we consider better? In other words, what do we value? Would it be more economic equality, better health, deeper relationships? These are all axiological issues. Sometimes researchers and writers are pretty obvious about this, but not always. Martin Buber is a guy, he's a communication philosopher, and he's been very obvious about this. He talked about an ethical approach to communication that contrasted with a more mechanistic approach. So he talks about I, it, meaning I am a person, but you, it, are an object. But we really should strive for, as often as we can, I, thou communication, where I am important in the communication, but you're a thou, you're also important. You have inherent dignity. You're special as a human being, and I should treat you that way. We should connect through dialogue. See, he has an explicit value for other people, and it's going to shape the way he does his research. So when I first got exposed to epistemology, ontology, and axiology and began to take it seriously, I developed a much more sophisticated reading of the research that I was exposed to. I didn't see them all as separate and independent pieces. I saw them all as having similar or different kinds of assumptions that informed their approach.
Okay, oleh sebab Socrates ni dia tak charge duit ataupun any yuran, dia welcome semua orang. Dia maksudnya dia alu-alukan kedatangan semua orang dalam lecture dia. Dan dia tak sengaja terajar ataupun telah mengajar enemy of the state, musuh-musuh negara, dan government ni ataupun kerajaan Greek telah menuduh dia sebagai seorang yang pengkhianat kepada sistem demokrasi. So masa dia nak dibunuh tu, masa dia nak dihukum tu, dia orang tanya dia, apa yang patut kami hukum kamu ni, Socrates? Socrates kata, aku ni gift to the world, aku ni I am something, okay? So aku tak sepatutnya dibunuh. Aku sepatutnya dihukum sebagai contohnya, sebabkan aku hebat sangat, aku patut dapat makanan free seumur hidup. Korang patut tanggung aku, macam itulah lebih kurang, sebab aku istimewa. So tapi dia found him guilty. Lepas tu dia telah dipaksa untuk minum racun. Itu adalah hukuman dia. Okay. So selepas Socrates mati, anak murid dia, Plato, okay, Socrates ni dia tak tulis buku, Plato yang tulis. Dia punya students. Jadi The Republic adalah buku yang berasaskan teori Socrates ni. Republic ni adalah dia pasal philosopher king. I think I have the book. The book is here. So this is the book, The Republic. So dia adalah mengenai apa itu justice dan what is the right type of government, apa government yang betul, dan kenapa kita kena how do I put this, kenapa kita kena kenapa kita kena pilih filosofer sebagai kita punya raja. Sebab filosofer memahami banyak benda daripada berbagai perspektif. Lepas tu kita ada last sekali Aristotle. So Aristotle tulis banyak benda. So antara yang paling important I rasa adalah allegory of the cave tu, yang di mana dia kata there is these people in the cave. So diorang telah diikat dalam cave tu dan diorang tak boleh keluar, dan diorang ada satu umbul api saja untuk survive. Dan diorang cuma nampak benda dalam cave tu. So satu hari apabila dia dah ada beberapa orang yang dalam tu terlepas keluar, dan dia nampak the sun is greater than this fire. Lepas tu orang-orang semua rasa macam no, you semua ni menipu ataupun gila. Lepas tu dia terus bunuh orang-orang ni. So maksudnya orang yang tak capai enlightenment tu tidak akan nampak apa yang orang nampak. Itu dia sebenarnya allegory of the cave. Okay, to move to next point. Okay, so next kita akan belajar scholastic philosophy. So apa tu? Kita akan sambung sekejap lagi.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History as we take a look in this episode at the Greek philosophers, the big boys, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. We're coming to get you. So if you're a kid in school, you have found the right video. And if you're a lifelong learner or if you're cray-cray on the internet, you're welcome to watch as well. So we're going to go giddy up for the learning right now and go get her done. All right, guys, why don't we start with Socrates, because he's the first one. And not much is known about his life, everything that we know, because the dude didn't write anything down. I was like the smartest guy ever not write anything down, because he liked to talk a lot, he liked to ask a lot of questions, but he didn't like to write stuff down. So what we do know about him, we're going to know from his student Plato, because Plato wrote everything down. In what were called dialogues, which were a recollection or an imaginary conversation that he's having with his teacher Socrates, but I'm getting off track. Now Socrates, it's thought, is born near the city-state of Athens around 469 BCE in the golden age of Greece. This is where people are, learning and growing and building and sculpting, and there's democracy. It's a wonderful world. Now, he's born in moderate means. His mother was a midwife, his father was a sculptor. It's thought that he was a soldier at a certain point who fought very valiantly with a lot of courage, saved a lot of lives, did a lot of great things. But then he wants to be a philosopher. Now, a philosopher is basically somebody, it literally means lover of wisdom, who is seeking out answers to truth. They're seeking out answers about the existence of life or about knowledge in different subject areas or value or reason. And at that time period, most philosophers were called sophists. And sophists like Protagoras, who was one of the more famous ones of his day, were really people that were paid teachers. They were people that believed there was no universal truth. There was really only man, and that man was the measure of all things. And Socrates kind of disagrees with that. He believes there's a universal truth. Now, the story is there is an oracle at Delphi that informs one of Socrates' friends to tell him that he's the smartest dude of the land. And Socrates is like, there's no way I'm the smartest guy. So he starts going around to the leaders and to the important people of Athens to kind of question them about what they know about life. And he's figuring he'll find out that there's got to be someone smarter than him. And he starts doing what's called the Socratic method. He starts asking these people questions when they tell them things that he knows. And he starts to find out through this Socratic method that these dudes really don't know what they're talking about. So he ends up figuring out that he is the smartest person, not because he knows anything, but that he knows that he really doesn't know anything. Two of the more famous quotes that are attributed to Socrates really sum him up, and they are, "An unexamined life is not worth living." And the second quote is, "True knowledge exists in knowing that you know nothing. Only thing I really know is I don't know anything at all." And then he starts after that really just kind of being what's called a get-fly. He's a social critic. He's messing with people. He's doing Q&A. He's walking around asking people about beliefs that they have held forever, and he's trying to show them that they might be wrong. They should be looking for universal truth rather than accepting the status quo, and that's going to land him in hot water. He's trying to root out ignorance. He believes that false beliefs are dangerous, that if you believe that a car won't kill you if you cross in front of it, you're in big, big trouble. And if you believe that the root of all happiness is money, you're in big, big trouble. So he's not really trying to lecture to people. He's not trying to tell them, I know stuff and you don't. He's using the Socratic method of questioning people to make them examine themselves and their own beliefs so he can expose truth. They can expose truth to themselves. But like I said before, he's in big, big trouble, and he's going to get arrested, and he's charged with 2 crimes. Heresy, that he's corrupting the young people's minds with all of these questioning. And the second is that he has violated the gods. So now he's in big, big trouble. And now it's a democracy, so they had a jury. How about that? There was about 500 people it's thought to be on Socrates' jury, and they hold this big trial. And at the end of the day, he's found guilty by 30 votes. That's it, 30 votes. And he was actually asked, what do you think your punishment should be? And Socrates replied something to the effect, I think you should give me free food for the rest of my life because, I'm a gift to you people. What are you talking about? He also had an opportunity to escape, as Frank Crito had arranged that he would be able to get out of Dodge. He'd be able to get out of Athens, and Socrates says, no. Number one, I put you in danger. Number two, where am I going to go? Because I'm not going to shut up my big mouth. I'm just going to get in trouble somewhere else. Number three, if I fear death, then what does that say about me? That I know something about death? I know nothing, so I'm not going to do that. And number 4, there's a social contract here. I'm part of Athens society. I'm a law and order kind of guy. A jury of my peers has found me guilty. I'm going to take the hemlock. I'm going to take the poison. I'm going to die. And that's what he did. It's thought that his last words were thought to be something to the effect to his friend that we owe a rooster to the god of medicine for what he has given me, that now his soul would be free. So that's the very basis of Socrates. You just really want to say, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything, and we can figure it out if we ask good questions. All right, our second Greek philosopher, batter up, is going to be Plato. Plato is going to be the student of Socrates, and he is going to write everything down. A number of dialogues that he wrote and other famous writings such as the Republic. He's also going to leave behind a great university called the Academy of Athens, which existed for hundreds of years, and that's going to be the first institution in Western civilization of higher learning. He believed it was the job of society to, through the Socratic method, to enlighten people, to people enlighten themselves, and that to have a great society, more people needed to be enlightened. He believes in a sense, a utopian society. Some people would say, hey, Plato, you're being too idealistic, wanting all these great things in terms of happiness and a great society and perfect friends and great beauty. And he would say, no, that what we need to do is envision form. What is a perfect society? What is beauty? What is a great friendship? And we need to have a rational plan to get there. One of his most famous writings was about something called the cave, an allegory in the Republic. And it's basically a description of how he sees society. He says that imagine if society was living in a cave, a dark cave chained to the floor, and all they had was a little fire that cast shadows on the wall. And that they would live there for centuries looking at these shadows, and they would develop great theories and wisdom and intelligence and knowledge about those shadows. And then one day somebody would figure out, I can crawl out of the cave. They'd crawl out of the cave, and there would be the glorious sun shining upon life itself. And this person would be amazed. They would see things they never thought ever existed. They would be a little bit closer to seeing true reality. Not all of it, but some of it. They'd then crawl back in the cave, and they would tell everybody, you people don't know what you're talking about looking at those silly shadows. I've seen more. I'm telling you that this is reality. I'm closer to reality than you'll ever be. And then they kill them. And this is kind of an analogy of what it's like to be somebody who's enlightened, to be a philosopher, somebody who thinks about things versus most people who don't think about things. So he wasn't a big fan of democracy. He believed democracy was kind of like mob rule, like the people in the cave that didn't know what they were talking about were running everything. He believes in something called the philosopher king theory, that the only people who should be leading should really be people that were these people that asked these big questions, that were seeking answers, trying to get closer to truth, and that would be the best way to guide society. So that's why he started the academy, in order to train people in the art of thinking and in knowledge and in wisdom so they could create a better society for the generations that followed. He even got in big trouble because he would point to Sparta and he would say, look it, they have a truth they know of, which is the military. They have a vision. They want to have the best military. Everything they do, they plan to have a great military. And guess what? They have a great military and they whooped us. So why don't we do the same thing? Instead, our objectives will be truth and honor and justice. And then we can get to that through rational thinking and planning. It was said that when Plato met Socrates, after he was introduced to the Socratic method and learned a little bit, he burned all of his previous writings because he was so out of whack before he met Socrates. All right, guys, our last of the great Greek philosophers is going to be Aristotle, who was called the master, the great thinker, the philosopher. When you're called the philosopher, you must be pretty good at philosophy. He's born in 384 BCE, and at the age of 18, he goes to the great Academy of Athens, where he is a student of Plato's. And of course, he's going to be exposed in all of the different disciplines at that time period, and he's going to excel. It's said that he was the best of Plato's student, and he stays there till he's 37, when Plato passes away in 343 BCE. At that time, Aristotle goes to become a tutor, probably the highest paid tutor in all of the universe, tutoring Alexander the Great. How great is it to tutor Alexander the Great? And he must have done a really great job, because Alexander the Great goes on to conquer the Western world. Alexander the Great is said to reward Aristotle with all of these awesome resources, where Aristotle's then going to go back to Athens and start what's called Lyceum, a new school with a great library that's borrowed in much from Alexander the Great. Now, Aristotle is going to be a little bit different than his teacher, Plato. Plato was focusing much on the ideas of idealism, of truth, of form, and Aristotle's a little bit more scientific based. He's looking at the empirical data, at what's observable. But at the same time period, he said that happiness is the goal of life. One of the biggest teachings under Aristotle is going to be called the golden mean. And basically, whenever you're examining something, let's say you want to be a great conversationalist, there's always something in the middle. You can be a bore. You can be really boring. We all know those people, when you talk to them, they're really boring. And then you can have people that are buffoons. It's like the other side, right? That's where they're not deficient in a skill, but they're excessive in a skill. They're always joking and they're not serious and they won't shut up. He says that witty is the middle, that is the mean. These are people you want to converse with. He talks about bravery, right? You have the extreme, which is recklessness. And then you have the deficient behavior, which is cowardness. And then you have courage in the middle. So he says we should seek the golden mean in life. One of my favorite quotes from Aristotle, and I think it goes to the heart of his philosophy, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. He's also considered to be the father of logic, of rational thinking, of breaking it down. And that's what all the Greek philosophers do. They break it down. I hope we broke it down for you. So there you go, guys. I hope that you learned a little bit. I hope your brain's a little bit bigger. I hope you passed your test. And I hope you subscribe and watch more videos. How about that? I say it at the end of every lecture because I believe it with all my heart. Where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you guys next time you press my buttons.